Asians can go into fight or flight mode, right? Where they're fleeing, they're telling their elderly to stay indoors. But what I see a third response beyond fight or flight is we're flocking. By flocking together, we're going to these rallies and finding strength and allyship. By flocking, we're creating a collective voice.
Hi, everybody. My name is Marc Cruz. I'm with the Broadway Company, and we are so grateful and so lucky to get to spend some time talking to Dr. Russell Jeung, who is a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University and also one of the co-founders of Stop AAPI Hate, which is an organization that tracks COVID-19 related discrimination in order to develop resources and interventions that fight racism.
I'm Yvette. I'm also a part of Hamilton with the LA company, and we'll be doing this together. But I guess we can just start off, and Dr. Jeung, if you wanted to kind of just tell us a little bit about your story and where you come from and kind of how you got here today, being professor and the co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate.
Well, I'm a this is a long story. I'm a fifth generation Chinese American from California. Grew up in San Francisco in a really politically activistic community. And so being involved in the community, going to Chinatown all the time was part of my family history, and went to college and really wanted to affect social change. And I tried to do that in different ways in politics, in media, and ended up those who can't do teach. And so I became a professor. And so I teach public policy and I teach community change. So when COVID-19 was coming, I knew that we needed to document what was happening. And I knew Asians would be blamed. I knew that Asians would face racist violence, that there would be racist policies against us. So we created Stop AAPI Hate, having seen what was beginning to emerge in traits of racism against Asian Americans.
Why is it important to record these things, and what do you do with the statistics that you gather?
People don't think Asian Americans, maybe as a model minority, have any issues or have problems. So we really needed to document that we do experience racism, actually widespread, institutionalized, historic racism. And by documenting it, we actually saw that surge. We received hundreds of incidents when we first launched Stop AAPI Hate. It's a website that collects self-reports. And the stories were horrific. So not only do we have the numbers, we had the voices of Asian Americans telling us how vile they were being treated. You know, they were getting yelled at with profanities and racial slurs. They were getting pushed and shoved. So I wasn't surprised this year to see elderly attacked and killed. I wasn't surprised by the Atlanta shootings because these incidents were so terrible. So by getting the data, we got government's attention. By having the stories, we gave Asian Americans a voice. And together, I think that helped get the issue on the agenda of both politicians and the media. It helped people recognize this isn't an Asian American issue, actually. This is an American issue of racism and violence. And that's what was needed. We needed the data to teach people's minds, and we needed the stories to shape people's hearts about the racism we're experiencing.
And this is the data that is being collected is what types of incidents particularly, because it doesn't always rise to the level of crime, as I understand it, that it's all kinds of incidents of discrimination, racism.
Right, it ranges. So in the news, you see a lot of the hate crimes where people are getting assaulted, but we're getting a variety of places in multiple populations in different ways. So, but the four main categories of racism we're tracking are civil rights violations, such as being mistreated at the workplace or being denied a ride share, online harassment that really impacts our young people, right? They see so many racist memes, offensive posts trolling that they experience indirect racism. we experience a lot of microaggressions. There are verbal harassments, or we get shunned. People noticeably avoid us. And these microaggressions, though, aren't, to me, micro. They're actually racially traumatizing. 1 out of 5 of our respondents are displaying long-term symptoms of depression, anxiety, avoidance, and hypervigilance. These are the hallmarks of trauma. So again, a lot of our respondents who experience racism are being traumatized through this verbal harassment. And the final category is assault. And there's 2 types of assault. We're getting coughed and spat upon, so much so that we actually created a special category. We could just check off, someone spat on me. And that makes up 8% of our cases. My own wife was running and someone blocked her path and just coughed in her face. So we're getting coughed and spat upon. And then there are physical assaults where people are, again, pushing and shoving us, throwing rocks and bottles at us. A lot of times people try to run us over with their cars. So the racism, again, happens to all ages. It's at multiple sites, at schools, online, public transit, and stores. But they're all traumatizing. They're all harrowing.
Absolutely. And I think it is so important that I think it's great that there is this, like, I guess what's the word? Your organization is collecting all this information in one place, because I don't think there's ever been anything like that. And you're right, it's so important just for people to know about it and to be heard and to understand that this is a real thing that's happening.
People don't think, like, how do you know there's a surge in racism, right, against Asian Americans? And I say, in 2019, nobody was spitting and coughing, as far as I know, on their fellow human, right? Nobody was pushing and shoving grandparents, but they have been in large numbers across the nation in 2020 and continuing this year. Yeah.
My follow-up question is, I guess, so once you've collected this data and I guess it's being passed on to, like, law enforcement and government, I think is what I read. I guess because I think the emotional side of that is so important, of just having that information out there and for us to be seen and heard. But then what do, like, law enforcement and government agencies do specifically with this information? Or what is the hope, at least?
Mm-hmm. Well, to make a correction, we do not provide information to law enforcement. Okay. We're actually concerned that, for Asian Americans who don't have documents, right, they could be reported. We don't want to criminalize communities of color. So we actually do not provide information to law enforcement. We do provide numbers, and so we don't provide individual incidents or cases, but we do provide the broad numbers to show government this is happening. And we do encourage, especially like the Department of Justice, to expand their civil rights enforcement, to expand hate crime reporting. So our data is presented to government to impact policies, not necessarily to address individual cases. And hopefully, I think, because we've presented our data, we've met with the White House, and President Biden has issued executive orders. We've met with the Attorney General, and so the Department of Justice is expanding its civil rights work. We're working with Congress, and so that's why they're passing hate crimes legislation and ethnic studies curriculum, which is really important. This one piece was actually recommended by our youth interns. They created their own policy report, and Congresswoman Grace Meng just introduced ethnic studies curriculum funding to tell our story, to tell Asian American history in our schools. So our youth have spoken up, and Congress has heard.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. That's so inspiring, because, like, I didn't have much of this education. A lot of the history, Asian American history, is not something that I learned in most of my schooling growing up. So, I think that it is American history, as you said. It's part of the larger picture. So that's so important. I think that's wonderful. It's sort of like in that sort of vein of history, you mentioned that when COVID-19 struck, that you were almost not surprised that incidents of hate started happening towards AAPIs. So this is not just like happening in a vacuum. This didn't just start this year, that this is part of something that's patterns that we've seen throughout histories ever since Asians have been in America. Can you speak a little bit about some of the patterns that this current wave of violence is connected to?
Sure. History does repeat itself, especially for Asian Americans. So whenever, again, a pandemic came from Asia, Asians were blamed and then were met with violence and racist policies. That's, again, the yellow peril stereotype, that we're to be feared because we bring our diseases and our hordes of people to overtake the West. That's the idea of the yellow peril. That fear was invoked during the Chinese exclusion years in the 19th century, when the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy were blamed on Chinese. And as a result, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It happened when the bubonic plague came in 1900, and health officials quarantined Chinatown, segregating Chinese, allowing whites to leave, and keeping Chinese detained in that area with barbed wire, so presumably to get sick. When Asians came to Angel Island at the immigration center, if you were seen to be medically unfit, you would be deported. And even with tuberculosis, another disease that Asians had high rates, if you were found to have tuberculosis, you would be quarantined again and face family separation. So both sides of my family, both on my dad's side and my mom's side, had the kids separated from their parents for long term. So with this yellow peril, you could say even within my own family, my family has been excluded, detained, quarantined, segregated, deported, and faced family separation because of this yellow peril fear, this use of health policy against certain racialized bodies. So the pattern continued with COVID-19. We've seen violence, and there were like at least 5 or 6 pieces of legislation that excluded Asians from entering the US because we were either seen as health threats or national security threats. Clearly
runs very deep and has been around for a long time. How, this is this is a wide reaching question, but I guess, in addition to collecting the data and introducing more education into the younger generations, how would you suggest people who want to be active about stopping AAPI hate and getting to the root of white supremacy, not just against Asians, but all BIPOC folk in America? What can we do other than be reactive and report incidents that have already happened? Like, how can we be preventative also?
Yeah, the big picture response is, for me, the roots of racism is that Asians are seen as perpetual foreigners, as the yellow peril, as not belonging. And what we need to do then is to reimagine and tell a story of an America where we do belong, an America that we want to belong to. And that's why Hamilton is really important. That's why ethnic studies is really important, is reimagining an America that we want to belong to. Now, I don't want to belong to the old America. I don't want to go back to normal because we mass incarcerate, we mass detain, we mass ban Asians, we mass shoot Asians. So I don't want to go there. What we all need to do, again, is to work together to rethink an America where there's no white or black or insider or outsider, but an America, again, where we take care of our elderly and have opportunities for everybody. So that's the broad scale step. On the individual level, it's people have to be upstanders, we call them, people who intervene when they see racism, whether online or in person, people who use their vote well, people who spend their money and donate to ethnic communities. So I think it's like climate change. We could change. We need large systemic issues, right? We need policies to address climate change on the large level, but we all can do our individual part too.
Sort of along with that, I'm noticing that part of the mission of AAPI Hate is to be able to fund community organizations on the ground. Is that correct? So that the responses to incidents of hate are coming from these organizations, they're usually the first to respond.
Yeah, well, that's what we're promoting. And so that's one of our policies. We don't necessarily are the funders, but that's the policy we're promoting, that we need, especially victim services that are sent to the communities, right? Because we know who the victims are, could speak their language, could provide trauma care. And so that's one of our policies, is that we need culturally responsive victim services and even witness services, right? A lot of Asians don't want to speak out because they can't speak to the police officer. So we want to work with local community who can respond better to the Asian American community. Again, this is nationwide. And so we're trying to build a network across the nation where groups can be responsive to Asian American communities.
Do you guys have like a line if somebody is in crisis in the moment where that is a service that's available? I guess
That's a great idea. That's what we're proposing. So good job, Yvette. You could be a policymaker.
Yes.
But what's really difficult is finding enough mental health therapists who understand the issues that Asian Americans face, the trauma we're experiencing with the fear, and can speak the language, right? So that's what we're working on. Now that we have more capacity, we want to be able to help people and connect people with mental health professionals who have that expertise.
Right.
We also want to train people to develop that expertise. It's really needed, especially on all levels. So I could go on and on about the racial trauma Asian Americans are experiencing, but my college students and high school students really talk a lot about their mental health status during the pandemic.
It's not a small project, I would imagine, especially because of the skills that are needed to make that happen and the infrastructure, and also because there are so many languages in Asian American Pacific Islander world. I see a future for it, hopefully.
Yeah, so there's a mental health response, there's a legal health response, there's a policy response, right? And then trying to be proactive with education to change the media. And Stop AAPI Hate just started with 3 of us. We're sort of like this garage startup, and with all of us having full-time jobs. So only now do we have a little bit more capacity to deal with it. But like you said, fighting racism is a huge project, right? It's going to be a long-term project. And there's a lot of ways we have to get at the issue.
If people do want to support Stop AAPI Hate, what can they do?
You could support by donating at stopaapihate.org. You can, again, as an individual, support your local community by being good upstanders, by donating and patronizing Asian businesses, and reporting if you do see an incident.
I'm sort of curious to know about in this past year, as a result of this violence that has happened. I feel like, and if there's been sort of any measure of this, but like there's a different sort of sense of collective identity among AAPIs. Do you feel that to be true? Do you think that we're sort of finding a new way to come together as a community that, and unfortunately, it's the reason for it is terrible.
Yeah, the reason's terrible. And again, because we feel so threatened, Asians can go into fight or flight mode, right? So I know Asians are arming themselves, giving their kids mace, or they're fleeing. They're telling their elderly to stay indoors. We're not sending our kids back to school. But what I see, a third response beyond fight or flight, is we're flocking. And by coming together, especially at these vigils, we can provide solace for each other, right? By flocking together, we're going to these rallies and finding strength and allyship. By flocking, we're creating a collective voice. So I do see the Asian American community really flocking at this moment in unity and in solidarity with other communities of color. This flocking has really heartened me, right? I'm really angry by the racism. I'm really distressed to be part of a society that produces people who could just cough and spit on others. But what keeps me going is that unity I see, that flocking, and Asian Americans from all walks of life standing up against the racism. Like I said, high schoolers are really standing up, our influencers are, but we have like data scientists. You don't think of data scientists as being activists, but their numbers have really changed the state of Asian America. So yeah, I see this as a real movement now. It's a global movement to fight for justice and to to work in solidarity. And that's what keeps me going, is this movement that we're building. And thank you for flocking with me, Hamilton people. It supports me
too. Flocking with us. I'd be remiss to not ask a question just getting to speak to you. But I guess in a lot of conversations I've been having in the past year and before the pandemic too, but especially this past year, there's been a higher awareness of colorism within the Asian community. I guess the question constantly remains like, what to do?
Yeah.
And how to address that?
No, that's a really good question, because hurt people hurt others, right? Abused people abuse others, and people who've been treated racistly can become racist themselves. It's learned. And so my fear, as Asian Americans experience this surge in racism, we become anti-white, we become anti-Black, right? And so, like you said, we need to really examine our own implicit biases. We need to check our own colorism. We have to check our own privilege, our racial advantages now. Because if we don't, we're just going to perpetuate that cycle of violence, that cycle of racism. The way we do that is by flocking, by discussing with each other the pain that we're feeling now. And this is what I tell people with kids, this is a great teaching moment to teach our kids racial empathy. As they feel like they're on the outside, if they feel like they're stigmatized, then they understand how other racial groups may feel racially profiled for being outside threats, for being, seen as dangerous. And as we build that empathy, as we feel our pain, then that's the process of healing, right? As we flock together, we heal. And that's how we check our colorism. My hope is that healed people become healers. And Asian Americans now, even though we could become more racist, can also become more healed from the experiences and the traumas we've been dealt with. We can become racial healers for America. Wouldn't that be amazing if now we turn this really dark moment into a time where we've been so moved that we become racial healers rather than perpetuating what's been going on in America?
Yeah, because I think Asian Americans are in a very unique place. I mean, every minority has its own experience.
Yeah, everybody could.
Yeah.
But my call to Asian Americans is, let's be those racial healers, because because the U.S. needs us.
Yeah. Why not take on that responsibility? Yeah.
That's the Asian America. It's the political identity. It's such a open-ended racial identity. So maybe part of our identity, because it's open-ended, because we have the freedom to create it, because we have the freedom to embody it, let's be a racial group for justice, a racial group for healing.
I think that's a beautiful and hopeful note to end our conversation on today. Both flocking, going out, and also going within and doing work in both directions and being racial healers. That's a really inspiring note. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.